Hello everybody, welcome back to another Rudolf Steiner Spiritual Science with Patrick Dixon. I have Patrick with me here again. Welcome, Patrick.
Alright.
I wanted to talk about Buddha because I recently put up the Rudolf Steiner lecture, The Mission of Gautama Buddha, on Mars. I was saying the moon earlier, but on Mars. So Patrick, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about Buddha and Buddhism, and perhaps even from the Rudolf Steiner perspective.
Yes, I mean, Buddhism, as was generally thought to have manifested itself first with Gautama Buddha about 600 years before the incarnation of the solar Logos. And what Buddha was about initially was freeing oneself from the wheel of incarnation. And really, this was very specifically for him, for his future mission, which he wasn't totally conscious of at the time that he was doing this. It was the purification of the astral body, non-attachment, this ability to free up what was, the astral body is constantly being pulled out to satisfy desires of all kinds of sensations, to not allow that to happen. And this, sitting under the Bodhi tree, sitting symbolically under the higher consciousness, he sat still. It was maintaining this stillness when the astral body is compelling you to move, to seek out, to follow desires, to wait until those die down, or rather those desires, instead of being turned outwards, are turned inwards and upwards. And what he was trying to attain was the nirvana, which is this awakening in the aerial body of the earth itself, the body of the air. Hence, all the teachings that the Buddha absorbed before he established his own teaching were based on systems of yoga which had come through the earlier Indian culture, which produced the Vedas, which is the cosmogenesis, the Sankhya, which is the genesis of the human being, and yoga, which is the reconnecting of the human being to the cosmos in a new way. All had been based on this idea of breathing, mastering the breath, because at that time breathing was intimately connected with thought. So you could literally breathe in a thought or breathe out. You were dependent on your breathing, and when you controlled your breathing, your consciousness would become aligned with the rhythms of the universe. This is really what the whole thing was about, rather than your astral bodies setting in motion your heart or your breath in a sort of disturbed way. So you can tell people's breathing changes, their heart rate changes, when their astral body is getting inflamed or excited in a certain way. What Buddha was talking about was how to still that, how to use the breath so that it is not responding just to earthly desires, it is reconnecting with a higher cosmic purpose. And the purification of the astral body was really one of the main things that the Buddha was talking about. And he was saying, once you do that, then you can enter the spiritual world and stay there far longer, because you're far more in tune with it. You're already on the earth embodying aspects of the spiritual world, because you're no longer the slave of the senses, which also was later on followed by all those Christian saints, this withdrawing from sense satisfaction to find the real source of your own being. So he sat under the Bodhi tree and, in a way, went through all the chakras, which were also synonymous with various yogic teachers that he went to. He went to all teachers who taught about the mysteries of the different chakras, the root, the sacral, the solar plexus chakra, the heart chakra, the throat chakra, the brow chakra, the crown chakra. There were teachers who specialized in these particular chakras, and he went to all of them. And he said to them at the end, I think he said, is there anything else? And they said no, but he didn't believe it. And that's when he had to go and find something which was beyond that, which was this experience of nirvana. And one thinks about the life of Buddha, who was karmically came down to earth as a prince. He had everything, all that which has come from good karma, and his first thing was to detach himself from all that had been given on the earth plane to him. His riches and his wife was a very sad, seemingly sad thing when he parted from his wife, because in a way he was saying, I must leave you as I am. When you see me again, it'll be a different kind of love. It'll be something. So it put her through a great trial to deny that normal kind of love that they felt and to go beyond, to find something even greater, So that was a big, huge change. And the Buddha went through many stages of his existence. And now there are many manifestations of Buddhism in the world, but most of them don't understand that the Buddha was just one of a series. In fact, 12 Buddhas, which were connected with the 12 bodhisattvas, because a bodhisattva is the stage before Buddhahood is attained. And Buddhahood means that you don't have to incarnate again. And usually you're given some great planetary task to fulfill in the spiritual worlds. And the bodhisattva has many incarnations to attain to that Buddhahood. And the bodhisattva's task is to absorb as much knowledge of the world as it is, and then bring spirituality to it. So what's interesting about the Buddha is that after death, after attaining nirvana, he then, after he died, he attained nirmana kaya, which is a higher state, a still higher state. And he then could consciously realize how he was connected with the descending of the solar logos, that was a part of his mission. And then he was given the task eventually. One idea is, as Steiner speaks about, that Buddha appeared with the angel Gabriel, with a shepherd. So you see really how the greater world spiritual streams are uniting, and they are all really one. And it's only for the influence of materialism that we have these little separations between them. The connection between Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism is like the difference between the root is Hinduism, the stem and leaves of Buddhism, the flower and fruit is Christianity. But all of these impulses are in all of them. And the Buddha would realize that. And so he was very much involved with that experience of the incarnation of the solar logos. And then later this idea that Steiner speaks about, the Christian Rosenkreuz, who was a very high initiate, had a meeting, and it was decided that the Buddha's task then was to go to the Mars sphere, not the Mars planet, really the Mars sphere, which was really that which gave the Earth, in the first half of the Earth's evolution. The Mars sphere was about separation, which produced competition, which produced conflict, all those things that take away the peace, the mindfulness. So, and the next half of evolution is the Mercury half, which we're entering now, which is about communication and communion and working consciously with others. But the Buddha had to go into the Mars sphere to, in a way, prepare this Mercury to, as it were, calm down these influences of Mars. Mars was a very important influence for the Earth initially, because it brought the iron into the Earth, which laid the foundations for the separate self, the separations which are necessary before conscious communion could exist. So that is, in a way, where the Buddha is working, the Gautama Buddha is working now. The next Buddha is the Maitreya Buddha, who will come in a couple of thousand years. The Maitreya Buddha is, his impulse is, Steiner talks him as the flesh-made word, as opposed to the solar logos is the word made flesh. And what the Maitreya Buddha emphasizes is that all the bodhisattvas are teachers. Christ is not a teacher. Christ is the subject of all teachings. Christ is a power, a force. It's beyond pure teaching. It's wisdom. It's really the 12 bodhisattvas are the in-raying wisdom that teaches about the outraying cosmic love of the Christ. That's the real position. And there'll be other Buddhahoods about after even the Maitreya, but that's really the importance is to get this sense that the present Buddhism is a bit stuck in this idea that Gautama is the only Buddha and that's what it is. And they don't see there's a connection with Christianity, with esoteric Christianity. They would even get annoyed if you said there is, that there is a real deep connectivity between these phenomena, these beings. So, and present Buddhism has the records of the words of the Buddha, but what the Buddha is speaking now is different from what he was speaking when he was on the earth. And that's also true of, obviously, the Christ. These beings are also evolving. And the most important thing is us to get the present experience of the influx of the Spirit, because what the world is doing now, under this great pall of materialism, it's living off spirit, what I call spiritual capital. That is to say, all the spiritual development of the past, of all spiritual teachers, saints, all these beings, all human beings who did, they left a kind of vast store, and what's happening is we're feeding off it, and we're using it up because it's of the past. It's like fossil fuels. Instead of, and what we have to do as well is to pick up the relationship to the present influx, and of course that's where materialism utterly denies. So you can call yourself a Buddhist, but you can be a total materialist, really, because you're just living off that. You're not receiving any new inspirations. You think it's all in just that, in the leftover canon and writings of the original Gautama.
With Buddha, you were saying about he's connected to karma, and I was reading recently in one of Steiner's lectures about how our hearts is where our karma from this life is going, preparing for the next life, and that all our karma is being worked in our heart, ready for our reincarnation, our next reincarnation, where our head will be made of our heart, lungs, liver and kidney. So I found it quite interesting you were saying about Buddha and the heart and karma. Do you want to say anything on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, the heart impulse in Buddha was about, what you have done previously and what your moral stance to other beings. Hence the great impulse of compassion. What is that basis for, interconnecting oneself with the greater spiritual purpose of the world. It hasn't reached yet what I call the full agency of the divine solar logos heart, the power of utter transformation of every being, whereas the Buddha was talking, first of all, it was the transformation of the self. Then you can become a servant of the cosmos. Whereas, this is the thing that many people do not distinguish. They always, especially when you get from the adversary, somebody says, I'm the reincarnation of the Mahdi, and I'm the reincarnation of, all those things, and you're everything, and they mish them up all together. And there's a real difference between all these different states of being. The bodhisattvas are quite different from the Christ being. Christ being is something totally unique in that sense that it is the primary, it was there before the bodhisattvas, and it's the alpha and the omega, and that's really important too. So we give back Buddhism its place within the greater drama of the world, all these 12 beings, what they're doing. And the East has some great understandings, and we've got to respect that. But we've also got to see it in a bigger context, because in one way, the great Eastern impulses of like the Vedas and Buddhism have been infected also by the lower aspects of the Luciferic forces. So people escape into that kind of Eastern thing. A lot happened in the 1960s, because of also the overarching materialism, very powerful sort of drying up process of the soul, the withering. Many people in the West went in an indiscriminate way to Eastern teachers who promised them, this deliverance, this fluidity, this you're beautiful, I'm beautiful, we're all, that. And that was because, and people were so thirsty because of materialism, they would drink from all these different, and some of these teachings were like poisonous oases, because they made you dependent. They didn't really address your true evolving nature, so.
You also spoke about Buddha being enlightened under the tree. Earlier, before we did this recording, we were talking about trees and being with trees. Maybe you could talk a bit more about what you were saying then about being part of the tree and bringing out its soul and your soul.
Yeah, I mean that's of course one of those great things about elementals. You know, the elemental beings connected with plants and animals and stones and air and water and fire. In the sense that we have to, our etheric bodies now are very pressed into our physical body, which is like we see objects. But we generally don't have a perception, or we don't train ourselves to perceive what's going on inside, the interior movements. I mean, you look at a tree. What's happening, and there's different times of the year it changes, but you've got one currents flowing upwards, the xylem, and then other, which are really bringing water and minerals up, and you've got the phloem, which is bringing sugars and nourishment down, and they're crossing over, and this is also an image of the, you know, the chakras in the human being. You could say the crown chakra comes in the flower and the fruit and the seed, but when you look at a tree and you think it's rather like this merging that Ari talks about, you really try to enter into the interior movements as well. You get a full image of all the things that are going on, that you can see it from all ways round, and you also perceive all the seasons in one moment, you know, the spring, summer, autumn, winter, the whole experience. Then that is very healing. It brings vitality. What the tree gives you, what those forces, those powerful etheric forces give you, this great vitality, which is connected also with the longevity of trees, because you have given what they ask for. They want, the elementals connected with the tree want to feel the soul again, and through the soul of the human being, they, as like a window which shows them the higher worlds, their first parents, and the divine being, the Christ. That's what they're wanting, and because in that they resist the effects of being totally mechanized. They can't do it out of their own being. They need us to do it. We need them to show us how to take further the elements of the earth. They need us to show them, to reconnect them to their cosmic origins and destiny.
And that reminds me of what I was reading in this lecture about Buddha being on Mars. Steiner says that he needs us and we need him. We can still connect with him in this Mars sphere and draw down what he's trying to do up there to this planet, which obviously at the time we seem to be going through a lot of war and conflict again. So what he was sent to do in the Mars sphere, we need to draw down to this sphere. Would you like to say anything?
That of course that is true, and of course what that being would say, the Buddha would say, is that this what you're doing, why that is, and that is how that's connected with the far greater evolution of the world, the evolution of the planet. I mean, great as he was, but his perspectives now are much, much greater. You know, he's working with these beings who are the primary creators of the world, and what their purpose is. So he would be, influence coming from him would also activate that in the human beings who received it. So when you connect with him, you connect with all sorts of other states of being.
We recently did a recording on Rudolf Steiner in America, and when I got home the file was all corrupted, so we could not use it. So we thought we'd try it again now, and I thought it would go quite well with what we've just said about Buddha, especially with all the conflict going on in the world at the moment. And we were talking about America, weren't we? And you started off talking about what happened in America at the time of Christ and Golgotha. So I wonder if you'd like to just explain all that again about what was happening over there with the black magician.
Yeah, and this is very controversial, but it's connected with a greater planetary mission of what we call the Americas. At the time of the mystery of Golgotha, which was the planetary changing thing, there was in America a magician who is synonymous with the being called the false prophet, who was involved in human sacrifice. But there's a very, very specific purpose for this, and it's connected with a numerological form, is that the intent was to sacrifice as many human beings, to take out the hearts and the stomachs, and also even beheadings, of as many human beings who had been involved in the lines of descent from Abraham to the incarnation. And it had to be done in a certain amount of time. This would have given this power, a power to this being, such enormous power that had it succeeded, it would have activated the sixth interior sphere of the earth, which, one has to understand that there are, according to spiritual science, 9 circles in the interior of the earth, spiritual ones, which are converging towards what I call the conspiring circle, which is where black magic. And what does that mean? Black magic is that fully conscious opposition to the divine plan. Most people who do bad things or evil things or wicked things are not conscious of anything within the greater system of the world. They do it out of weakness of all sorts of ways. But this particular magician was a very, very powerful being working consciously against what was happening in the Middle East. And to do that, he had to work in a place which was the middle of the Americas. There was another middle, and it was the middle of the future. And what it was being attempted was to literally cut out the heart of the great American phenomena, which is, from pole to pole almost, there is a line, a spine of mountains. And in a way you've got the nerve sense system of the north, the metabolic system of the south, and the rhythmic system of the Central America. In Central America there's very unusual conditions, because you've got these meeting almost of the Pacific and the Atlantic, and you've got winds and currents that flow in and out. There is a real specific movement, a kind of rhythmical movement there between these particular, and interestingly enough, the volcanoes of Central America, when they erupt, usually spread their plume over the entire earth. The way the winds and currents are so configured is that when they give up this effluvia, it is a way of spreading everywhere. It gets caught up in these world encircling currents. So what this black magician was trying to do, he was watching occultly, clairvoyantly, the events in the mystery of Golgotha. And what the mystery of Golgotha was doing was laying the foundations for the immortal human being, the ability to climb once again up the ladder, fully consciously. We came down unconsciously, we will ascend consciously. And the divine task was to literally, in a sense, walk the tightrope across the abyss from mortality to immortality. And only that being, the Christ, could do it. No other being in the universe could do what. But this being realized by the dark forces was that if they could, it's an image, but if they could cut the rope, they could stop this happening. The divine being wouldn't be harmed himself, but the task would not be able to be done. So what had to happen is that another being from the Sun Lodge, a great adept, had to come down before that and prepare to meet and enter into a kind of conflict with this black magician. And what this being did, it's called Vitzli-Putzli, it could be other names, this being was educated in the understanding of all the elementals of the earth, and how originally they were all in beautiful rings around the earth. But because of the fall, because of various things done by other beings, the rings are slightly broken. You have the rings of the tundra, the taiga forests, the tropical rainforests, the deserts. If you look at the earth, you can see there are really remnants of these circles. The equator has obviously the tropical rainforests. What this being Vitzli-Putzli did was to reactivate the rings in a kind of chorus at the same time as confronting this black magician, who was then crucified upside down. This elemental chorus nullified the spell that the black magician had already working on, because had he succeeded, what would have happened is a gigantic earthquake would have taken place, and perhaps a volcanic eruption, which would have split North America and South America, and that would be symbolically the splitting of the metabolic, taking the heart away, and having just that nerve sense and that, the will and the thinking, without this heart force in the middle. That was the attempt, whereas what was being consolidated in the Middle East was the real cosmic human heart was being developed. So, and if this being the Black Magician has succeeded, this volcanic eruption would have literally, in some senses, taken his body up into a kind of dark ascension, and then spread it as a cloud over the whole earth, like a nuclear winter, in which Ahrimanic forces and beings could have radiated down onto the earth a complete new set of formative forces, and cutting out the higher worlds altogether from reaching humanity. We now see this in a modern form. You could say, in one way, this is rather like all the satellites of the Earth now being put up, locking together into a kind of metallic sphere, cutting us off from which is a further development of the Ahrimanic intention, made mostly completely unconscious in the people who are doing it and what they're doing. But this particular battle in America, because he didn't succeed, the Black Magician didn't manage to do, and I say black is dark, and because it's wait, you can't say black in the same way, but he didn't succeed fully in what he had to do. But however, he left residual forces over from that deed, which we now see in the cartels. We see it in even the death cults of Mexico, and also in the southern states of America was where you got this strong enslaving impulse, and you got Alamogordo, where the atomic bomb was just over the border in New Mexico. So these are all forces which were working from this deed, and even into the American psyche now, all over, especially North America. It's like this inner life, which you get in Europe, is very difficult. It's very strong in will, it's very strong in thinking. So what does that mean? It means that to get your feeling life working, you depend on external stimuli. Hence this great sentimentality coming through the sort of Hollywood, that whole thing. It has to be produced from the outside. It's not, as in the German culture, is very much developed within. Even the Latin cultures. It has to be. But then again, of course, America. We know this idea that America was waiting for all that had been developed from the ancient Indian culture, then the Persian, then the Egypto-Chaldean, the Hebrew, coming from the other direction, the Greeks. Because, generally speaking, the motion was northwestwarding of the points of civilization, which culminated, in a sense, in Europe. And thence we had, the big events like we had the Roman Empire at the same time as the Incarnation, the establishment of law, the system of democracy, polluted by Rome, but the democracy then travels up into, these realms where you get this more democratic relationship with the monarchs and the kings and things like that than it was just a tribal leader. There were systems which were developed. So this democratic idea was going through metamorphosis. And then you have the Renaissance, They went back to the Greeks, brought forward that into this Christian stuff. Then you have the Reformation, then the Restoration. You have all these. Then you have the so-called Enlightenment, when scientific concepts and ideas flooded up into the human being. Only possible because of the resurrection. This is what's totally unknown, really, because in the mystery of Golgotha, the descent into hell was releasing, entering that realm where the Ahrimanic beings had taken down all the memories of higher devacanic processes of creation, all the coordinates and the subtle, vast mysteries contained in living organisms, was taken down, and it was kind of frozen and decontextualized. It was out of sync with what was present in the spiritual worlds, but what was being created in this dark alchemical laboratory were principles which then surfaced in the Enlightenment and gave them all these mechanisms, mechanical concepts, engines of various different kinds. It's even started in the Renaissance, but particularly in the Enlightenment, which is a necessary thing, because it's about, really, it was allowed to happen because because of the resurrection, the ego was divinized to a certain extent that it would be able to deal with, able to work with Ahriman, So you could have people, very Christian souls, who were working very much in this mechanistic way. But the danger is also that the mechanistic thing could overcome the spiritual, and become more powerful, which to a certain extent it did. You have the after the Enlightenment, which was almost the conceptual realization of all these forces, renewed understandings, which was then applied more, experimented more in the Industrial Revolution, which is more to do with England. So you see them moving more and more west. And then the next great thing was the climax of going to America. And we know that the whole American Revolution was about separating from the old, taking the best of it, separating. A lot to do with money to begin with. But it brought over Rosicrucian and cosmic principles, and the principles that were first of all manifest in the Greeks. And the Greek idea of democracy itself, which was before the incarnation of the solar logos, was being, in fact, that's what was affecting it. What was affecting consciousness in Socrates, Plato and Aristotle was this unconscious realization that what this solar logos was bringing to the world, which you could say was a spiritual democracy in a way. And then this American thing, it goes to America, and you have various countries like France, Holland, Britain, Spain mainly in the South American continent, and all these influences were at work. And at the same time, this great land had been waiting almost. Both the native Americans, it's interesting, you could call them a race of nations. What happened in modern America, you've got a nation of races. You've got this whole different thing correlated. But that, in a way, all that had happened before wanted to come to this new world. This was an idea that there's a whole new place that we can realize all the things that we've developed. But of course, that morally they weren't developed enough to know how to integrate the indigenous peoples with. So generally there was a great conflict. And because what they didn't also understand was that underneath America, precisely because of this pole-to-pole connection, forces of electromagnetism were very, very powerful, which are imbued with Ahrimanic forces of materialism. So that also infected America in all sorts of ways at this earliest, and people wanted to go there because they saw this glowing land which they could take and do all the things they'd never been able to do before. But that was at the expense of a lot of that which was already there. And then you have the very interesting thing about, it's quite controversial, about the slave trade. That in a certain sense, some African folk souls realized that a tremendous damage had been done to this heart realm in the Americas. This wasn't in the African person, but this was in their higher folk souls. And it should have been, had people realized it properly, there would have been a conscious moving of souls in that direction to do something. But that stage of world evolution wasn't there yet. And the dark magician was also, forcing it into enslavement, because they would have realized the danger of the healing force. So they would have counteracted it with those residual forces to enslave. And so that all happened there. And then you have the whole thing in the northern states. You have the southern sort of semi-conscious forces which wanted to hold on to property, wanted to hold on to this particular way, and the enslavement. And then north, there's higher, still the Rosicrucian. And then we come to this whole mystery of, present state Washington, city of Washington. This, in a way, in Washington you have so many indications. You have this great statue of Lincoln, but it's on a scale rather like the Sphinx. It's on a high-level Egyptian, like a pharaoh, which is, and you've got all around Washington, you've got these kind of Masonic states, and also, so what they're doing is they're taking things from previous civilizations, like the Solomon Temple, the Greek temples, so they're bringing a synthesis, saying all that's ever existed in the history of culture, we're now concentrating it here, and this is what will lay the state for our constitution. So, and this is why the Statue of Liberty, the land of liberty and freedom, this is new, this has never existed before. It is the synthesis of everything that came before. But unfortunately, it is always dangerous to get too optimistic. I mean, because, that's with the adversary attacks. It likes to see these things that it can twist. So it has been, in many ways. I mean, but it's important to remember that America is something that everyone wanted, and thousands of people, like many people are trying to come to England, they see whatever criticism one has of this European culture, is that it has something in terms of just basic security and the ability to speak what you want, still there, compared with some, as we've seen recently, how dictatorships can fall, and there's no doubt about it, the people didn't like it, and they wanted to get away from it. And America held out this light of idealism. There's going to be more land, there's going to be more opportunity, there's no longer the old monarchies to control. All that stuff was drawing human beings there. But in a way, some ways prematurely, because human beings had not yet developed enough to have that freedom, because that was the thing that was being offered, freedom. But are you really ready for it? That can become licensed to do anything you want. And that goes back to this idea of the Buddha, the purification of the astral body. Only when you got to that level can you really deal with that. But the battle is all over the world now, this kind of separation between autocracies and democracies. I mean, I see autocracies, to me, most of them are retrograde. They're trying to reactivate in a fallen way, the divine right of kings. I do what I like. The democracies are subject to corruption. You can't see in autocracies because you're not allowed to have that, but it still happens. But I mean, democracy is a much more complicated thing. You're dealing with the very great complexity of Ahriman's effect on the earth, whereas in the old autocracies, you're more or less dealing with a kind of Luciferic thing, sort of self, just glorification. But you've got a mixture of both, but that requires a great, development of one's discrimination. Otherwise, you get polarized in very specific views. Because when you're dealing with these things, you have to say, yes, there is good there, and there's bad, and that's it. It's much more complicated than what most people think, because people want to fall into a position of safety. I know what it is. I now know. I know. I don't want to think anymore. That's it. I've decided. You can't do that unless you have an understanding of the vast complexity of spiritual purpose that is working through us, through our evolution.
Do you think that this black magician, he could not be redeemed, it seems, so he's not reincarnated, he's somehow managed to survive on because he was strong enough to develop some kind of everlasting body?
That's very complicated. I mean, there are various people who've spoken about that. Daniel Andrea speaks about these sheaths that are developed by the Antichrist. This idea, even Christian fundamentalism talks about, this being this wonderful, incredible, skillful, guy, and then on his side is a kind of Oriental master. This is seen as the false prophet. And the false prophet. The false prophet is a very complex idea because, in some senses, the false prophet is also about all that science fiction is talking about. The future they talk about. We're going to get out of a multiverse. All this stuff is really. It's very powerful, very convincing, but it is to a certain extent to do with the false prophet. And the power of the Antichrist is to, the false prophet says, yes, back him because he can make it, he can do it, he's got the power to activate these possibilities. But that's also very, to what degree do we see one being the focus of these forces in the world? It could happen. It could happen for a moment. I mean, there is the famous story of the two witnesses who confront the Antichrist, literally. They confront him and the false prophet, and they say to him, confess yourselves to Christ, what? And they can't. Suddenly there's, that's the revelation. What he's saying, what the witness is saying to him, can you step down from there, give up all your power, and just become like us? Can you do that? And immediately, that is utterly can't, no way. So that's an image of that. But then we have to say, what is the Antichrist? It's something which has got something of Lucifer, something of Ahriman, and something else as well. I mean, because Steiner is very clear that both Lucifer and Ahriman are able to be redeemed. But there are something that can't be can only be destroyed. Ahriman has to be, Lucifer has to be checked on, and he's but not put in chains. He has to do what he has to do. Ahriman has to be put in chains and only released gradually as the human ego is able to consciously redeem him through the Christ, whereas the seraphic being really his only salvation is total destruction. I mean, you go into all sorts of extraordinary sort of existential questions, but it's important to deal with what we've got to deal with now, and I think to get an awareness of the geography, the spirituality of the whole world. How most in the Southeast Asia, there are certain parts of the earth which are much more like the ancient part. They're much more volcanic, they're much more, liable to these kind of storms, which is like a replay of Atlantean and Lemurian conditions. As you go north, west, you get a great fixity. The mineral kingdom is fixed, and that's so consciousness could develop to a certain level. And this will change. And now, of course, in Mexico, you've got a mixture of both, because Mexico City is, on the one side, it's got a very volcanic area, and the other side it's got a fault line. So it's very much, and that would have been something to do with what this being did. It was like an after and after effect. And and America, I said it in one of my articles I wrote, that in a sense, when the Western Europeans came to America, especially North America, they cut down enormous amounts of deciduous forests, and this enhanced what became in some ways the tornado alley, because they had allowed the Arctic currents of air to come down unimpeded and the Caribbean currents to come unimpeded the up way. And because in a way what a forest does, it cools the overheated and warms the overcold. So forests are really breathing, they really are moderators. And what they destroyed, through greed, through wanting to have this land or get gold or all the stuff they did, there was no ecology, there was no sense of the ecological, you're always going to get something coming back. And that's what we're learning now, so.
You were talking about the mountains. In America it's because they're lined north-south, but over in Europe it's west-east, and Steiner talks a lot about this, that makes a big difference.
Absolutely.
So maybe you could go into that a little bit, because I sometimes find that a bit complicated.
Yeah, that's also to do with this idea, north-south is very much what I call the mission of America is to balance the thinking, feeling and willing. That's the full, whereas the Russian thing, this is why was this great open heart, with a tremendous lateral power. It's reaching out, and a lot of the mountains are aligned more, east to west, like the Himalayas. They act as a kind of diaphragm between different parts of the earth, modifications. So, and the heart in the Middle East would be regulating that as well. I mean, of course, the whole anatomy has been slightly shifted out of kilter because of various things, but that impulse, that's why America and Russia have been so, because they couldn't see that they were two parts of the cross, which were separated, the great horizontal heart and the great vertical consciousness one. So.
And what would that be for the other continents then? Like, let's say Australia and that. I don't know if Australia's got mountains, to be honest.
It has got mountains. Mostly its mountains are more on the east, not that high. It's got mountains on the southeastern part. Australia is very interesting because you've got the tropical on the northeast, semi-tropical, tropical. You've got these two great deserts, the Simpson and Gibson deserts, and you've got various states in between, mostly on the east coast. You've got this little bit on the west coast. You've got the Perth. You've got a great deal of desert, semi-desert in Australia, and of course that's also where the dream time was. My view is that dream time had within it this idea of this world of the, heaven on earth, which moved over and became morphed into the American dream eventually, which was the dream of, heaven on earth, the land of opportunity, all that stuff. But what the ancient Aboriginal consciousness was to understand the elemental beginning. Australia, of course, according to mainstream science, is true to a certain extent, separated itself more and more from the main body, and so it wasn't connected with the main progress, which is also true of China and to a certain extent of Africa. But that means that Africa's thing was about this moving to America as well. And Africa's, like all of these places, will have their day where their consciousness becomes a leading force. So, yeah.
And do you think also that with what's been going on in the world, not just politically, but also physically, I know people talk about climate change and things like that, but we have had earthquakes in strange places. Britain's had a few earthquakes of its own. A lot of volcanoes are going off, a lot of volcanic activity around the world, and the weather change all the time and all this heavy rain. Do you feel that's part of the dark forces trying to fight back to stop the Earth evolution, or is that part of the Earth evolution?
The thing is, the higher powers can always turn whatever happens ultimately to the good. But in a way, they're trying to deregulate the rhythms of the Earth, which is rather like also, on a more cosmic level, the satanic forces, or the cosmic satanic forces, they're trying to interfere with the regulation of planetary motion even through comets. There's an attempt to try and deregulate, because in that way they can interfere with the whole process, the cycles of evolution. So this would be an attempt to do that, to disturb the Earth in such a way that our attention is taken away from our true task. You need to have a certain stillness, a certain regularity before you can grow to the next level. And if you're doing all this all the time, you're disturbing, you're preventing that from happening. And the elementals they're waiting for us to bring a new consciousness to them, to become a window through which they can see again, and then a doorway through which they can reconnect with the higher world. Our mechanistic thinking is preventing that. So what's happening is they come up to the wall of our own materialism and they bounce back, and that's what causes a lot of the disturbances. We're not releasing them, we're mistreating them, we're abusing them without even knowing it, really.
Which is quite heartbreaking in a way, that people can't see what they're doing because they don't want to work with the Earth, but a lot of people take it as the Earth's there for them.
Yeah. This goes with this idea that the Earth is just a thing, a storehouse of things we just use, we just dig up, that's it, with the resources, rather than a being that we've got to somehow help lift onto another level. That's what the indigenous peoples mostly have, the concept that the Earth is the mother being. Whereas, to modern science, the Earth isn't that, it's just a thing. Those ideas are just seen as superstitions. But actually, we need to work with the clarity that some of modern science has, but with those other archetypal forms as well.
So after all that we've just been discussing, what is our role, or what should be our impulse for helping the planet evolve and humanity to evolve?
Well, I think it's to awaken to a greater purpose, which is also a change of what we think about the meaning of work. We should all be aware that we have work to do, a work that is both inner, which has an effect on the outer spheres as well. If we develop our thinking, and we know how to let it go and breathe it in and breathe it out, in a sense, we are serving the Earth just by being in a certain way. That is serving the elementals, the other beings of the Earth. We're given this illusion by the Ahrimanic beings that unless you're earning a lot of money, unless you have a successful business, you're not really working. That's whole concept of work. And most of these big companies, especially the big transnationals, they're totally profit motivated. They're not serving. They're always trying to cover up when people say, what about ecological? Oh no, well that comes second, because profit motive is first. And my view about the big transnationals is that most of them are fallen archangels. They have the exact same effect on groups of human beings the folk souls have, but they're fallen. They're actually the enemy of the folk souls. That's why also transnationals, you always hear about them, they're kind of enemy of indigenous peoples, because indigenous peoples are still keeping something alive which just gets in the way. And then they want to cut down all these forests to build this particular thing, or do that, or extract this or that and the other, disregarding the subtle developmental stages that other human beings and nature is taking. So that's those forces have to be fought. And they're difficult to fight because on the outer level they have all the power. But that's where this inner development, by developing the truth, true thinking, it becomes, and more will it become a potent force. Also, we have to remember that when we think true thoughts, we're already nourishing souls that are coming in. That's what we're giving. We make a matrix, a living matrix through which they can establish a new relationship with the earth by sending up, thinking about them, thinking about what their consciousness is going to be, or should be, or could be. That's really important. And not only those, but those who have passed on to the other side after death. You're working with them. You're reinforcing, changing their views, giving them a new perception. That will really help the development of the earth. So, it's a belief in the transmutation, the true agency, because one of the things that the adversary forces do is want to tell you, you have no agency. You only have an agency if we give it to you. And it's only agency because it serves us. If it's not serving us, you can't have any agency. We have to be aware of that. I mean, even imagining a world dominated by the materialistic forces completely is important exercise. If you can do that, you're already having an effect on it which won't make it, not like saying, oh, I imagine it, then you'll make it possible. No, it's the opposite. When you can really imagine it, you're taking away the wind out of their sails, because they don't want anyone to know what they're doing, really.
Well, that's why I get quite worried about these people that do doom and gloom all the time, and what they call fear porn, of constantly, looking at doom and gloom and then talking about it, thinking about it. Everything's not going to work. Everyone's going to, be trapped in these kind of programs or whatever. But I'm trying to get people to not think like that and to think more. Let's turn that around. If they're inverting everything, well, let's put it back.
Yeah. You've got to think positively. I mean, I think, but there are more those who just dwell on doom and gloom and they haven't got any hope. They just give up. And I meet people all the time say, "Oh, what can you do? There's nothing. The world's going to," And then there are those people who don't want to. You talk about these dark. Well, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. I just want to think. That's also not really a true one, because I just want to say I don't want to think about that. It's just there. You've got to say, I'm prepared to think about it, but I believe that we have powers within us that can do something. But we have to understand what we're dealing with. It's like in The Lord of the Rings when Strider says, to the hobbits, beware of the dark riders. Don't underestimate them. You've got to know what you're dealing with. When you do that, then you have the power to do. If you deny them, I don't think they exist really. They don't really exist. That's a false positivity. You've got to say, I know what they are. And this is where things like anthroposophy are really good, because there's real clarity about that, about these beings and what their purpose is, and how, in a way, they can all eventually be turned to the service of the world. But it depends on us to do that, and our consciousness.
Well, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to make us think he wasn't there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Or he wasn't there, or he comes and he says, well, I'm something else. I mean, his great sleight of hand, I'm actually God. I'm the good guy. I've been doing it all along. That's the great thing that he will try to convince the world. That all this. I don't know if you read Solovyev's The History of the Antichrist.
But that's something actually a lot of people come to me about. How can I tell whether it's going to be the Antichrist coming? I don't want to be fooled, but I've been fooled by people in the past who've come across as if they're the best, and they're actually up after something else. It's something people are concerned about. They don't want to be fooled.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's said, they shall fool even the elect. I mean, what that means, you've got to look at events. Where you see big hype and all that stuff too much, you see people giving up their thinking. People want to run away from their own responsibility, and they just want to lay it all on somebody else and worship. Don't worship. The only thing we should worship is the Christ in others. That's the difference, but not, put him on this pedestal. That's the real danger. I mean, this idea of 2 or 3 meet together in my name, that's much more, it's that quiet, you meet the Christ in human beings all over the earth. It's this gradual process. I mean, the whole adversary force, discrimination is the most important thing. But the temptation is because we're so much confusion, so much doubt, so much fear, people will fall for anything that seems to promise, you know, a deliverance. And that's what the adversary forces will do. They will try to set up events which will promise either escape from all your pain or an answer to it all. And, you know, that's where you have to remember the true nature of the mystery of Golgotha, the Christ being the real power that will deliver us. It doesn't go with materialism, because in materialism you don't have a soul, so you don't need a soul to be saved, sort of thing. But it's to counter those false thoughts. And, you know, you just see events where one person is being raised up and on a level which may have a talent, but it's overhyped. I mean, to put it a difference between, say, a lot of pop stars and things like that have all this technology. You have amplifiers, microphones, you have all this electronic stuff. If you took all that away, often there'd be very little left. Then you go to an orchestra, you know, where guys have learned to play the violin, and those instruments are very difficult. It's years of work to play that well. And it's just them. It's not, you know, hyped up enough for, that's a difference. So I would say this, you're very rare, when you go to the Promenade concert, that is a real interesting, when you say, I love this great gathering of people, because they're all so full of reverence and enthusiasm for that skill and dedication. When you go to some other sort of concert, which is just noise, and you know, there's drugs and there's noise, and it's just, you know, there's no real, you know, it's almost
a lot
like
of effects.
they're almost like worshipping their own chaos. You know, they see the outer chaos. Oh, it's like my chaos. Oh yeah, I love it. You know, it's all right. You know, so I mean, there's a lot of popular music that's been very good over the years. You know, I'm not an avid follower of it, but I've been aware of it. Some really good stuff. But I can see also where those sort of things can mislead. And also huge hyped up films like blockbusters that can carry people along, and it becomes sort of, you know, there's a degree which we're allowed a certain amount of escapism, but when it becomes that's the main force, and of course the areas of the Aramanic are very much in the whole concept of the big industry, you know, the entertainment industry, you know, the consumer thing, you know, let's make something, oh, they like that, remember, this is good for the mass. We don't want that because it's too thought-provoking. You know,
it's also distracting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Mass distraction from the self. I mean, the great works of art should really feed mindfulness and self-examination. I mean, recently I've heard, you know, I get annoyed with this, the theatre, they've now got a Hamlet, which is kind of interfacing with the auto theft thing, you know, the video game.
Oh, okay, Grand Theft Auto. Yeah, okay. I didn't know they'd done that, but it doesn't.
You know, and then they've also got, what was another one? They had another thing which was similar, where they're bringing together two things, like we'll take from Shakespeare and they had that one where they're all wearing headsets.
Headphones.
You know.
So yeah, so they're not all enjoying it together. They're all in their own individual version of seeing what it is.
Yeah, it's taking away from that. Also, actors all wearing microphones and all that sort of stuff. You know, it's like it's taking, and you see Shakespeare being used and misused in all kinds of ways. And I feel like saying, look, write your own stuff. Write your own stuff.
Yes.
Don't feed off a thing and then diss it at the same time. You know,
it doesn't need reworking.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of concerned about things like this. For example, everybody always wants to go to this Abba Voyage, which is the holographs of the bands. But this is what's going to be coming in the future, isn't it? You know, and even our TVs will become holographic figures or whatever. You know, it's another way of keeping us all indoors, isn't it? At the same time, we're not seeing the real thing. We're seeing an illusion. But people like illusions.
You're also fixing what the human being is in a kind of electromagnetic form. You know, it's not. Whereas when we should look at a human being and say you can see all kinds of evolutionary potentials in that human being, which could even change the whole Earth, elemental structure of the Earth. I mean, that's real understanding of the actor or performer carries that within them. That's a kind of magic. And interesting enough, some of the comedians do that. I mean, they, you know, sort of, sorry, aberrated way. Stephen Lee, is it Stephen Lee?
I don't know.
He does a very
Stuart Lee?
Stuart Lee, yeah.
I listened to him on Radio 4, yeah.
And he, to a certain, and even that, when I first saw him, I thought, oh, blimey, every other word was an expletive. George Carlin. But he
was clever.
Oh yeah, and not only that, he also had there's a genuine thing within him, because one of the things he said, why do we all kill these people who stand for the truth? You could see that there was a genuine reality there, and he just basically stood up on the stage and did his own thing, which is, very impressive.
But he was also trying to make people see what was really going on. You could say the same for Bill Hicks and people like that, and at the same time, they weren't preaching, but they were trying to help people see through the illusion.
Yeah. They were to a certain extent speaking truth to power. They're also like the fool in Lear, who speaks truth to the king. He's the only one who can do it. It's like his sense of humour that he hasn't got, which he needs to get.
But comedy is a very powerful thing, and I do feel that sometimes we need to put. I'm still working on it. How to put these spiritual, esoteric messages into some kind of comedy, which I know you're working on with your various plays, which hopefully will be being performed soon.
Well, I hope so. I hope if I can get them together. It's a very difficult equation. It's one of the things I'm actually trying to do with my drama, this particular one as well. Is the most difficult thing is to marry, the very highest. I've got this figures from hell, but then I've also got this. I'm trying to bring in this mystery of the divine interception in world evolution. So those ideas can connect in a way, and with humour as well. Of course, which doesn't happen in the mainstream world. What they'll do, they'll take something sacred, but they'll then banalise it to being, modern. It's all about this. It's not that. It's kind of, which is, and what we need is much more holistic experience to be shown us, of all the possibilities, and a redemptive idea within it, which is a happy ending, but in a much more profound sense.
Sadly, this rational world that we live in now doesn't really want that. They want shock horror.
Yeah, they just want this endless distraction. And this goes with this ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's you don't want to see, you can't settle and look and see the fullness of an experience. You just, oh no, got it. It's like it's inability. That's an inner activity, astral body, which is going wrong. It's kind of being drawn, and eventually that would work onto the etheric body very profoundly, which would give various disorders, to the eventually the physical body.
So is that something that would have happened in childhood that would have made this astral body become distorted?
Well, yeah. Of course, it depends on all sorts of things, like whether the child was subjected to too much media, or there was uncertainty and instability in the parental relationships. There was no stability, so they couldn't concentrate at schools. That affects you later on. I knew some of that. My family is very dysfunctional in some ways.
What family isn't?
Yeah, exactly. Well, mostly, absolutely. Yeah, completely.
Well, from one family to another, I'd like to thank you very much, Patrick, for coming along and talking with me again. And I want to thank all the listeners. Patrick does his conversations at Rudolf Steiner House. If you want to see what dates they are, please do look at the Rudolf Steiner website, the events. So thank you very much, Patrick.
You're welcome. Yeah.